Good evening. Thank you very much. I'm just curious how many folks know a bit about TTIP or have heard of it before? Okay, I just kind of wanted to get an idea. Yes, I will be talking about focusing a bit on food safety, food and farming aspect of the agreement. But before that, I also want to kind of piggyback onto some of the remarks that Ulrike said and give some further examples of things that have happened in the U.S. on some of these regulatory aspects in particular. Basically, as she said, there is already robust trade between the EU and the US. I kind of characterize the TTIP as part of what I'm calling the, quote, modern day trade agreements that really began with NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, and the WTO. About 2 decades this has been going on, where trade agreements are really not about historical reasons for trade agreements, which is setting quotas and tariffs, but more about reducing these, quote, non-tariff barriers or measures. And the important thing, I think, for us to understand is that these barriers, what they call barriers, are what many of us would call really democratic, hardly gained, fought food safety standards, environmental rules, and public health protections. And so that's the umbrella of the things that are that they want to eliminate or reduce under these modern day trade agreements such as a TTIP. So we'll quickly then talk about a little bit about the transparency aspect again, and again give some illustrations of these regulatory mechanisms, and as part of that talk about the concept of harmonization, which is really central to this agreement, and then get into some of the specific food and farm sectoral negotiations. Just to begin with, or to add to the transparency issue, the non-transparency issue, as Ulrike said, the talks are done in secret, and the key for civil society groups is that there are no negotiating texts that are released. And traditionally, under NAFTA, under the WTO, the negotiating texts were actually released after every round of negotiations. So civil society, the media, the public could actually see what was being negotiated and, you know, have a say or something. And it's very important to see the negotiating texts themselves, because the language is very specific and means very specific outcomes. So that is just a constant call from civil society, is that we keep saying to our governments, we need to have the negotiating text. If you want any credibility to call this an open, transparent, democratic TTIP trade agreement process, we need to see the negotiating text. So this is just something we keep hammering away at. More to be said about that, but I think that's enough for the moment if you have questions. The other deeply troubling aspects are these regulatory mechanisms. And the first, of course, is the investor-state dispute system, ISDS, that Ulrike was talking about. The reason why in the U.S. we have found, for example, in NAFTA, we have this ISDA system, and we've seen the results over the last 2 decades in that taxpayers have paid over $400 million in legal challenges through the NAFTA tribunals. And these challenges have been things like if a country has banned certain toxins or pollutants, a company has sued a corporation has sued that country and said, you are expropriating potential profits, not even actual future profits, and the NAFTA tribunals have cited almost exclusively with those corporations or private investors. So there are land use laws that have been attacked, water laws that have been attacked. As I say, $400 million plus has been awarded to these private investors. Just to note, the U.S. has not lost a case, but I think that's more indicative of a power shift of, the U.S. First of all, U.S. corporations initiate most of the suits against Mexico and against Canada. Just to give another concrete example of how this works, the very first NAFTA case was a U.S. corporation, ethyl corporation, gasoline corporation, sued Canada because it banned a known neurotoxin called MMT. It banned that additive from the gasoline. Ethyl said, you are expropriating our profits, because they used MMT in their gasoline. They had that as an additive. Canadian lawyers told their government, look, you're going to probably lose this case in NAFTA courts. It's better to settle. They were being sued for $251 million. So they settled out of court, and what they did is they rescinded their ban on MMT. They offered an apology, a public apology to Ethyl, ever insinuating that it might possibly be a public health issue, and then they paid a fine of $13 million, so they paid less than they probably would have paid in the public court. So that's an example of the strength. Even just the threat of a lawsuit under this ISDS has a definite chilling effect and impacts countries' laws, rules, and regulations. As part of, there are many more investor-state dispute cases that have actually been decided, and we can talk about that if you have more questions and have more time, but I'm trying to keep within the time limits. The next regulatory aspect that we're very concerned about is, as Ulrika called it, the living agreement part of the TTIP, and that's known. There was a leaked EU negotiating proposal, and it revealed that TTIP negotiators were attempting to establish what's known as a regulatory cooperation council, and this would be to, quote, converge regulatory measures such as food safety standards, labeling requirements, environmental regulations, banking regulations, anything. And it was very interesting to note that this proposal is really remarkably consistent with the proposals of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and Business Europe, who wrote basically the papers and gave it to our trade negotiations to establish what they would want in this regulatory commission. And of course, part of the thing that's so frightening to many of us is that they would have kind of first pass to look at any proposed laws of any of the countries in EU or the US to see if it was within the trade terms of TTIP. And we're frightened enough right now that the negotiations are non-transparent, and if it goes to some kind of regulatory cooperation council, that's even many more layers of non-transparency, and it will take constant and vigilant watchdogging to find out even what's going on behind those closed doors. So we're very concerned. Both of these regulatory aspects can be used, as I said, to eliminate or greatly reduce many, many standards. Environmental, of course, we're very concerned about some of the food safety standards that could be reduced or eliminated. In the U.S., because many people kind of view the U.S. as being, often we don't follow through on the things we make other countries follow through on, but we actually have been impacted greatly by these trade agreements. And under the umbrella of harmonization, which is what TTIP and these other trade agreements say, we want to harmonize our rules to make it easier to have trade. And basically what harmonization means is that we are lowering our standards, or the standards go to the lowest common denominator of the standard. You cannot go above and beyond that bottom standard, because another country can challenge you as being, not, you're using a measure that's trade restrictive. So it's really lowering the standards to the bottom standard, and countries are prohibited from setting higher standards than what a TTIP agreement would set as the base bottom floor. That is really critical because that's how the mechanism for how standards can start to slowly but surely spiral down. In the US, just one example, we had our food safety inspection system for meat. Prior to the WTO, we had a standard where it said any meat imported into the US had to be, and this is important, this is where trade terminology really matters, equal to the US inspection system. And that prohibited a lot of meat coming in from other countries that didn't meet our inspection standards. But right after the Uruguay Agreement Pact was voted in, and that was the beginning of the WTO, the US, the standard went from being equivalent to equivalency. And what that meant was basically it lowered the standard. And almost overnight, the US then had to grant equivalency standard to meat processing plants in countries that before could not import their meat into the US. And today we have around 38 countries that we have these equivalency agreements with, and prior to the Uruguay round or WTO, maybe one or two of those countries were allowed to import meat. So this isn't, again, pitting, necessarily saying our standards are better than theirs or anything, but it's just a demonstration to show how countries really lose control of setting their own safety standards. So when we talk then about the sectors, I'll just kind of quickly say that in our view, and I think it's a pretty universal view, the EU has higher, when it comes to food safety, you have higher food safety standards. And that is largely because you follow the precautionary principle, which some call better safe than sorry principle. In the US, we do risk assessment principles, which basically means that we, first of all, you have to prove that a food measure is harmful. And if you can't prove that, then it's going to be on the market. So that puts the burden on consumers versus a precautionary principle that's putting the burden on the manufacturer or the person who wants to sell the item. In the US, the precautionary principle is hammered away at constantly by our negotiators. It's called that we're told in the US that it's very unscientific. That the European Food Safety Authority is just, well, they're not even brought up. But as you know, you have the European Food Safety Authority that does very vigorous scientific reviews upon which food safety regulations are based. One example is when the EU decided to reject the hormone-injected beef. The committee thoroughly reviewed the 6 commonly used hormone, and they unanimously found that the hormone residues posed a risk to human health. And one of the hormones was considered to be a complete carcinogen. Now, they banned this before they did this scientific review, but they banned it based on concerns that this had happened before. So that's the precautionary aspect of it. And as a side note, actually, under WTO, the US sued the EU and won that lawsuit. And the EU, for many, many years, paid about 116 or 117 million in penalties to the US and in tariffs. And that meant your tariffs on olive oils, on wines, on very key European export products to the US were much, much higher. And of course, I don't think I need to spell out for you what that could mean, for example, in Greece, to small producers who want to export. Suddenly, the tariff rates can be very, very high. So these, again, investor dispute mechanisms can have great impact on economies as well as reducing regulations. So again, we can elaborate more on the precautionary principle, but I just wanted to let you know that just this quote by a former U.S. trade official who's now working for the International Business Council commented that TTIP is only worth doing if we get rid of the precautionary principle. So business is very, very honed in on this aspect. What is at stake for Europe? A lot the U.S. began by asking the EU to accept once again, hormone-injected beef, injected with antibiotics. 80% of our beef in the U.S. is injected with antibiotics. Ractopamine pork, arsenic-laced chicken, although we just now, thanks to a lawsuit, have eliminated most arsenic additives in the U.S., but that wasn't the case a few months ago when we were asking the EU to also allow this chicken to be exported to the EU. GMOs, that's a huge issue, and I think there is some traction there. We can discuss that later, of course. And then the chlorine-washed chicken, of course, is another one. And while I have to say, after this last round in Washington, D.C., it appears, and I'm usually very cynical, but I do think that the EU negotiators, as far as the food and agriculture sector, many of these things, I think they're really holding their ground and saying no to. They will not accept the hormone-injected beef. They do not want chlorine-dipped chickens. However, what is rather disturbing is, so for example, the chlorine-dipped chicken, they said, both the EU negotiators and the US negotiators have said, we have found an alternative. But when we looked into what that alternative is, there's two things. One of them has to do with nanotechnology, and I'm not the expert on that, but we have some scientists who review nanotech, and we have great concerns about that. So we don't find that to be a really public health alternative. But the other alternative is basically a perioxide acetic acid wash. And the EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, has just done a review of that at the request of the US Department of Agriculture and our trade departments. And the review found some problems, but they have given their report to the EU Commission, and the Commission's about to decide on whether to extend to allow that in the EU so I do think with, again, there's a state of mind that we want some kind of agreement. So if the US keeps pressuring, and they absolutely will, that they want some chicken exports to the EU, even though, as you say, they don't need it. You have enough chickens in the EU to feed yourselves. But they're going to get something out of this agreement, and that they're already saying that this acid wash is the compromise. That's just an example of how you can start with something, and your negotiators may say, no, that will never happen. But then behind the back door scene, there can be other things going on that may happen. And again, this is where seeing the negotiating text absolutely is vital, because we need to know if that, in fact, is going to be a compromise. Okay, so I'll end. There's a lot of questions, I'm sure. In the US, you know, we, for the WTO in Seattle in 1999, that round of negotiations was shut down, and the agenda has not gone forth since, although TTIP is actually putting in all those things in Seattle that weren't accomplished. And the cry there was, in the streets, we had hundreds of thousands protesting, and it was called, "This is what democracy looks like." So I think the good news is we can show them what democracy looks like, but we really need to be aware of what's happening and come together to really tell our negotiators no to these things that are harmful. Thank you.